Hello and welcome. Find a comfortable position. Let the weight of your body settle into the surface beneath you. Perhaps you are in your favorite chair or tucked into bed, ready for the day to melt away. Feel the warmth, real or imagined, from the fireplace beside us. Listen to the soft, rhythmic crackle and pop of the embers. It's a timeless sound, a sound of safety and contentment. Breathe in, slowly and deeply, and as you exhale, release the noise of the day. Release the lists, the worries, the conversations that echo in your mind. Give them permission to fade, to become indistinct, like distant murmurs. Tonight, we are not here to solve the world's problems or even our own. We are simply here to quiet the mind, and we will do that with a story. True crime, for many, is a source of anxiety, a glimpse into the darker aspects of our world. But that is not our purpose tonight. Our purpose is different. We will approach this story as historians, as observers, as quiet chroniclers of events long past. We will focus on the details, the procedures, the quiet moments between the chaos. The narrative will be our guide, a gentle current to carry your thoughts, keeping them from drifting into the restless waters of your own concerns. There will be no jump scares here, no graphic descriptions designed to shock. There will only be the steady unfolding tapestry of a great mystery, told in a calm voice by the fireside. Our story takes us to Boston, Massachusetts, a city of brick and history, of cobbled streets and revolutionary ghosts. But our focus is on a particular corner of this city, a place of immense beauty and profound eccentricity, a monument to one woman's singular vision. We are going to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. But before we speak of the crime that would make it infamous, we must first understand the palace itself and the remarkable woman who built it. For the museum is not merely the setting of our story. In many ways, it is the main character. Isabella Stewart Gardner, or Mrs. Jack, as she was known, was a force of nature. Born in New York City in 1842, a wealthy family, she was educated, spirited, and possessed an insatiable curiosity for the world. After marrying John Jack Lowell Gardner Jr., a son of one of Boston's most prominent families, she moved to the more staid and conservative world of the Boston Brahmins. She did not, however, conform. She was a society figure who defied society's expectations. She was known for her flamboyant style, her intellectual gatherings, and her friendships with artists and writers like John Singer, Sargent, Henry James, and Anders Zorn. She was a patron of the arts, not as a duty, but as a passion that bordered on obsession. Her life was marked by both privilege and tragedy. The death of her only son, at less than 2 years of age, plunged her into a deep depression. A doctor, seeking to rouse her from her grief, suggested she and Jack travel abroad. It was this travel that ignited the fire that would define the rest of her life. In Europe and the Middle East, she began to collect. At first, it was manuscripts and rare books, but soon her focus turned to art. With the guidance of the young art historian Bernard Berenson, she began to acquire masterpieces with breathtaking speed and unerring taste. When her father died in 1891, he left her an inheritance of what would be, in today's money, nearly $50 million. This immense fortune, combined with her already significant wealth, gave her the means to pursue her dream on a grand scale. Her collection grew to include works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Titian, Botticelli, Raphael, Manet, and Degas. Her home on Beacon Street was overflowing. She needed a new space, not just to house her collection, but to display it in a way that was uniquely her own. She did not want to build a conventional museum, a sterile gallery with white walls and didactic labels. She wanted to build a work of art to house other works of art. She purchased land in the newly filled marshy area of Boston known as the Fens. It was a remote and unfashionable part of the city at the time, but she saw its potential, and there she began to construct her masterpiece, Fenway Court. She was intimately involved in every single detail of its design and construction. The building was designed to evoke a 15th century Venetian palace, a style she had fallen in love with during her travels. She incorporated architectural fragments she had collected from Europe columns, windows, doorways, and balconies from Roman, Byzantine, Gothic, and Renaissance periods. These were not reproductions. They were the real thing, carefully shipped across the Atlantic and painstakingly integrated into the structure. The heart of the museum was, and is, the magnificent central courtyard. It's an explosion of life and color, a vibrant, living garden sheltered from the harsh New England winters by a vast glass roof. Flowers bloom year-round: chrysanthemums, chrysanthemums, nasturtiums, changed out with the seasons according to Isabella's detailed instructions. The air is warm and humid, filled with the scent of damp earth and blossoms. The sound of a small fountain provides a gentle, constant music. Looking up from this lush oasis, one sees the 3 stories of the museum with their Venetian style, windows and balconies, looking down onto the garden as if it were a canal. The galleries that surround this courtyard are where Isabella's unique vision truly comes to life. She arranged the art not by period or by artist or by nationality. She arranged it by feeling, by atmosphere, creating intricate tableaux in each room. A towering Spanish altarpiece might share a space with a simple piece of Chinese furniture. A Renaissance masterpiece by Titian might hang beside a delicate textile, and a modern portrait by her friend John Singer Sargent might be placed near an ancient Roman sculpture. She mixed the sublime with the everyday, the priceless with the personal. Furniture, textiles, paintings, sculptures, and even personal letters were all part of the composition. Each room was a complete, immersive installation. And this is the most crucial part of our story. The detail that makes the later events so poignant. In her will, Isabella Stewart Gardner left Fenway Court to the public as a museum for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. But she included a strict and unforgiving stipulation. The collection must remain exactly as she had arranged it. Nothing could be added, nothing could be sold, and nothing could be moved. If the trustees were to ever change the arrangement of the art in any significant way, her will dictated that the entire collection must be sold at auction in Paris, and the proceeds given to Harvard University. So Fenway Court became a time capsule. After her death in 1924, the museum was frozen in time, a perfect, unchanging reflection of her taste and her world. The chairs remained where she placed them. The tapestries hung just so. The light filtering through the windows illuminated. The same compositions day after day, year after year. It was a palace of memories, a place held in a state of permanent, beautiful stasis. For 66 years after her passing, it remained so, until one cold, wet night in March of 1990. The city of Boston, on the evening of March 17th, 1990, was in a state of boisterous celebration. It was St. Patrick's Day, a holiday the city takes with particular seriousness. The streets of the Back Bay and the South End were filled with revelers, moving from pub to pub. The weather was miserably cold. Rain fell, turning to sleet, making the streets slick and shiny under the streetlights. It was the kind of night where people hurry from one warm, dry place to another, heads down, collars turned up against the wind. The kind of night where the unusual can go unnoticed. Inside the warm, silent sanctuary of the Gardner Museum, the day was winding down. The last of the visitors had departed, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors before the heavy main doors were locked. The museum was settling into its nightly slumber. The security for this palace of treasures was, by modern standards, surprisingly and perhaps negligently lax. There were no cameras on the exterior of the building. The motion detectors inside the galleries were old, and the guards knew they were prone to false alarms. The only connection to the outside world was an intercom system at a side entrance on Palace Road, and a single panic button at the main security desk, which, when pressed, would send a direct signal to the Boston Police Department. The security protocol called for 2 guards to be on duty at all times during the night shift, from 11:30 p.m. to 7:30 a.m. On this particular night, the 2 guards were 23-year-old Rick Abath and 25-year-old Randy Heston. He was a musician, a member of a local rock band, and took the job as a way to have his days free for rehearsals and his nights occupied by something quiet. He was known to be a bit of a slacker, sometimes showing up for his shift smelling of marijuana, occasionally bending the rules by, for instance, letting friends wander in after hours for a private tour. But he was generally seen as harmless. The senior guard on duty that night, Randy Heston, had a clean record and was considered reliable, though this was his first time working the overnight shift at the museum. He had filled in for the regular guard who had called in sick. As midnight approached, the city's celebrations were reaching their peak. The sounds of sirens and car horns occasionally cut through the quiet of the fence. Inside the museum, the guards began their routine. Heston went on the first patrol, a long walk that snaked through the 3 floors of galleries. He carried a flashlight and a walkie-talkie. His job was to ensure all was quiet, that no one had hidden themselves away in a dark corner before closing. The path was always the same. Through the cool, stone-tiled Spanish cloister, past the towering tapestries, up the main staircase to the 2nd floor, into the dim and hallowed Dutch room. The Dutch room was one of the jewels of the museum. It was a relatively small, dark wood-paneled room, dominated by a large fireplace, but on its walls hung a collection of art that would be the envy of any museum in the world. On one wall hung Rembrandt's only known seascape, the storm on the Sea of Galilee. It is a dramatic, breathtaking painting. A small fishing boat is tossed on violent, churning waves under a sky split between terrifying darkness and a sliver of divine light. The disciples are in a panic, struggling with the ropes and the sails. In the center of the boat, a serene Christ, just awakened, calms the storm in a touch of artistic bravado. Rembrandt painted himself into the scene as one of the disciples, looking directly out at the viewer, holding onto his cap. Nearby hung another Rembrandt, a small, intimate self-portrait etching from 1633, and on the opposite wall, a painting so precious, so rare, that its presence in any collection was a miracle. It was the concert by Johannes Vermeer. There are only about 36 known Vermeer paintings in the world, and this was one of them. It depicts a quiet, genteel scene. A man and 2 women are playing music in a sun-dappled room. A woman in a yellow silk bodice sits at a harpsichord, her back to the viewer. A man in a dark cloak plays the lute, and another woman stands beside them, singing. The light, as is typical of Vermeer, is the true subject. It falls softly from a window on the left, illuminating the rich fabrics, the polished wood, the checkered floor. It is a painting of profound peace and harmony. It radiates a quiet, contemplative energy that filled the room. Heston's flashlight beam would have briefly illuminated these masterpieces as he made his rounds, the light glinting off the centuries-old varnish. He would have continued his patrol past the Raphaels and the Titians in the next room, up to the third floor, and then back down again. Once he returned to the security desk, located in a small office near the Palace Road entrance, it would have been Abath's turn. But on this night, something was different. Rick Abath, for reasons that would be debated for decades to come, made a few small but critical errors in protocol early in his shift. Shortly after midnight, as he sat at the desk, a fire alarm went off in one of the galleries. Instead of investigating the source on the alarm panel, he simply silenced it. Then he silenced it again when it went off a second time a few minutes later. It's possible it was just another false alarm from the old system. It's also possible someone was testing the response. Later, Abath would make another unusual decision. He briefly opened and closed the Palace Road side door, a clear violation of museum security rules, which stated the doors were to remain locked at all times. He would later claim he did this to test if the door was working properly. 1:20 in the morning, the city was beginning to quiet down. The St. Patrick's Day revelers were starting to head home. Inside the museum, Rick Abath was at the security desk, watching the monitors. Randy Heston was somewhere else in the building, away from the control room. It was in this quiet moment that the intercom buzzed. Abath pressed the button to speak. A voice on the other end, a man's voice, said they were Boston police officers. They were responding to a report of a disturbance in the courtyard. They needed to come in and check it out. Abath could see two men on the small black and white monitor for the camera at the Palace Road entrance. They were dressed in what looked like police uniforms. They had hats and coats. One had a thick, bushy mustache that seemed almost comically large. Museum protocol was crystal clear. Under no circumstances was a guard to open the doors for anyone, not even the police. If there was a real emergency, the police were to be contacted through the direct line, the panic button, or by calling 911. They were never to be let in by a guard at the door. It was a rule designed to prevent exactly what was about to happen. But it was late. It was a holiday known for chaos. The story of a disturbance in the courtyard was plausible, and they were police officers. to a 23-year-old night watchman. Questioning to policemen in uniform might have seemed like a foolish, even insubordinate, thing to do. So Rick Abath, in a decision that would haunt him and the art world for the rest of his life, broke the most important rule of his job. He buzzed them in. The heavy door clicked open, and the two men stepped inside, bringing the cold, wet night air with them. They looked the part, more or less, but as they got closer, Abath might have noticed that the uniforms weren't quite right. The badges seemed off, and the mustache on one of the men was clearly fake, applied clumsily. But it was too late for observations. One of the men approached the desk. He told Abath that he looked familiar, that they might have a warrant out for his arrest, and ordered him to step away from the desk and face the wall. This was a clever, disarming tactic. It immediately put Abath on the defensive, making him worry about his own situation rather than the security of the museum. It also, crucially, separated him from the panic button on the desk. Abath complied. He was told to call his partner down to the office. Using the walkie-talkie, he summoned Randy Heston, who arrived minutes later, unsuspecting. As soon as Heston entered the room, he too was confronted by the men. The ruse was over. These were not police officers. Quickly and efficiently, the two intruders subdued the guards. They did not use extreme violence. They were professional, calm, and in control. They ordered the guards to lie face down on the floor. They produced rolls of duct tape and proceeded to bind their hands and feet. They wrapped the tape around their heads, covering their eyes and mouths, but leaving a small opening for them to breathe. It was a practiced, methodical process. One of the thieves supposedly said to the guards, "Don't give us any problems, and you won't get hurt." They were then asked if anyone else was in the building. The guards, terrified and immobilized, told them they were the only two. Once the guards were secured, the thieves' demeanor seemed to change. They were no longer pretending to be police. They were now in their element. They escorted the two bound guards out of the security office. They did not take them to a nearby closet or office. Instead, they led them on a long, winding walk deep into the museum's labyrinthine basement, a place of old pipes, storage cages, and dusty, forgotten objects. They took them to a utility area, far from any entrance or exit. There, they handcuffed each guard to a separate pipe about 40 yards apart from each other. The guards could hear but not see one another. They were left in the darkness. They were alive and they were unharmed, but they were completely helpless. Back upstairs, the museum was silent once more, but it was no longer a peaceful silence. It was the silence of a sanctuary being violated. The two thieves now had the entire, priceless collection at their disposal. They had the keys, they had the time, and no one in the outside world knew anything was wrong. The motion detector system had been designed to trigger an alarm at the security desk. But with the guards tied up in the basement, there was no one to see it and no one to hear it. The thieves had complete and total freedom. They were ghosts in the machine. They walked from the security office back into the heart of the museum. They seemed to know exactly where they were going. They did not wander aimlessly. They did not smash cases or vandalize the rooms. Their movements were purposeful. They walked up the main staircase, their footsteps the only sound in the vast, echoing space. They bypassed the first floor galleries, bypassed the Italian masterpieces in the Titian room. They headed directly for the second floor. They headed for the Dutch room. There, in the dark, they came face to face with Rembrandt's Storm on the Sea of Galilee. They did not gently unhook it from the wall. They used a sharp blade to crudely slice the massive canvas from its wooden stretcher. The sound of the canvas ripping would have been a violent tear in the room's deep silence. The painting, free from its frame, was likely rolled up, its surface cracking, its ancient layers of paint flaking away. They did the same to Vermeer's The Concert, cutting it from its frame. They also stole another Rembrandt, the small self-portrait etching. Before leaving the room, they took a flink landscape and an ornate Chinese bronze beaker, or Ju, from the Shang dynasty, which was sitting on a table. Their work in the Dutch room was done. 5 priceless pieces were gone. The empty frames now hung on the wall like hollow eye sockets, a shocking testament to the violation. But the thieves were not finished. They moved on. They crossed the second floor landing to a small hallway on the other side. There, they entered the short gallery. It was a long, narrow space connecting the Dutch room to the Titian room. On its walls hung smaller works. 5 drawings by the French artist Edgar Degas, sketches of horses and jockeys, full of movement and life. They also attempted to remove a large Napoleonic eagle finial that sat atop a framed silk flag. It was fastened securely to the wall. They struggled with it, but could not get it free. Frustrated, they gave up, but not before grabbing the flag itself. Their final act of theft was perhaps the strangest. They went back downstairs to the first floor, to the Spanish cloister. They walked past a magnificent floor-to-ceiling painting by John Singer Sargent. El Yao Yu, one of the most valuable pieces on that floor. They ignored it completely. Instead, they went to a small corner and took a single, small painting. It was Edouard Manet's Chez Tortoni, a simple, charming portrait of a man in a top hat, sitting at a cafe table, sketching in a notepad. It was the only piece they took from the entire first floor. The whole operation inside the museum lasted for 81 minutes, a remarkably long time. They had moved with a strange combination of brute force and specific knowledge. They knew to go to the Dutch room. They knew to take the Vermeer. Yet they seemed to be art novices in other ways. They cut the Rembrandts from their frames, a method that horrifies conservators and drastically reduces a painting's value. They left behind works by Raphael and Titian that were arguably more valuable than some of the pieces they took. They had even gone to the trouble of removing the tape from the museum's motion detector data printer so they could take the printouts with them. An act that showed a surprising level of forensic awareness. At 2:45 a.m., they made their final trip to the basement. They briefly checked on the guards, who were still bound to the pipes in the dark. They said something to the effect of, "You'll be hearing from us in about a year," possibly suggesting a ransom would be forthcoming. Then they left. They walked back up the stairs, through the violated galleries, and out the Palace Road door, disappearing back into the wet, dark Boston night. They carried with them 13 objects with a combined estimated value of $500 million. It was, and remains, the single largest property theft in history. Inside the museum, a profound silence returned, but it was a broken silence. The empty frames in the Dutch room were a gaping wound. The lonely eagle, finial, stood on the wall without its flag. The small, empty space in the Spanish cloister where the Manet had hung was a new, permanent shadow. The palace, once frozen in time, had been brutally altered. For the next 5 hours, nothing happened. The guards remained tied in the basement. The city slept. The greatest art heist in history was complete, and no one even knew it had happened. The sun would not rise on the scene for several more hours. The world outside the museum began to stir long before the truth of the night was known. The first blush of dawn on Sunday, March 18th, 1990, was weak and watery, filtering through a persistent cloud cover. The rain had finally stopped, but the air was thick with dampness, and the streets glistened with a cold, clean sheen. Early morning traffic began to hum in the distance, the first city buses sighing as they pulled away from their stops. For the rest of Boston, it was just another Sunday morning, a day for sleeping in, for reading the paper, for quiet reflection after a night of citywide revelry. Inside the Gardner Museum, the silence held. In the basement, bound to cold metal pipes, Rick Abath and Randy Heston drifted in and out of a state of exhausted consciousness. The duct tape over their eyes plunged them into a darkness deeper than the windowless room. The passage of time was marked only by the drip of a leaky pipe somewhere nearby. A slow, maddeningly regular metronome counting out the seconds of their captivity. Their initial terror had long since subsided into a dull ache of discomfort. A chilling cold that had seeped into their bones, and a growing, desperate hope that the morning shift would arrive on schedule. Upstairs, the great museum was a silent witness. The morning light, pale and gray, crept through the tall windows, and the great glass roof of the courtyard. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the still air. It touched the surfaces of marble statues and polished wood, and it fell upon the empty frames in the Dutch room, revealing the raw, brutalized edges of the canvas that the thieves had left behind. The gilded frames, once containers of immense beauty, were now just hollow rectangles, framing nothing but a patch of dark damask wall. They were voids, stark and eloquent in their emptiness. The absence was a physical presence, a gaping wound. In the heart of Isabella's creation, the morning security shift was scheduled to begin at 7:30 a.m. The two guards arriving for duty followed their normal routine. They approached the Palace Road entrance, the same door the thieves had used just hours before. They buzzed the intercom. There was no answer. They buzzed again. Still, only silence. This was unusual, but not immediately alarming. Perhaps the night guards were on patrol, away from the desk. Perhaps the intercom was faulty. They waited. As the minutes ticked by, a sense of unease began to set in. They tried calling the security desk on the phone. Rang and rang, unanswered. By now, it was well past the time for the shift change. Procedures were being broken. The guards outside decided to call the museum's security director, Lyle Grindle. They explained the situation. They couldn't get in, and they couldn't reach the night guards. Grindle, a retired state trooper, was a man who understood protocol and its importance. The inability to contact the guards inside was a serious red flag. He instructed the morning guards to call the police, and he immediately set out for the museum himself. The call to the Boston police was logged at 8:15 a.m. It was not an emergency call about a robbery, but a request for a wellness check on two unresponsive security guards. The first police officers arrived within minutes. Faced with the same locked door and the same silence, they began to assess how to gain entry. They walked the perimeter of the formidable brick building, checking windows and other doors. Everything was secure. Finally, a maintenance worker with a master key was summoned. The first thing they noticed was the unnatural quiet. The security office was empty. The chair at the desk was pushed back. A walkie-talkie lay on the floor. On the desk, the logbook was open. Everything seemed superficially normal, yet the absence of the guards was deeply unsettling. The police officers began a systematic search of the building, their own footsteps, now echoing in the vast, empty halls. They moved cautiously, unsure of what they were walking into. It was in the Dutch room that the true nature of the situation slammed into them. Even to an untrained eye, the sight was horrifying. The great, empty frame of the Storm on the Sea of Galilee dominated the wall. Its raw, splintered wood, a testament to the violence of the act. Pieces of the cut canvas lay on the floor like discarded scraps. Across the room, the same violation. The empty frame of Vermeer's The Concert. The small Rembrandt etching was gone, its hook bare. A detective would later describe the room as looking like it had been savagely attacked. The alarm was raised immediately. This was no simple wellness check. This was a major crime scene. More police were called. The building was sealed. No one was allowed in or out. The search for the missing guards intensified, now infused with a sense of grave urgency. Officers fanned out, their voices calling out Boston police into the echoing spaces. They moved from the sunlit galleries to the shadowy corridors, from the administrative offices to the deep, labyrinthine basement dot, and it was there, in the cold, damp darkness, that they found them. An officer's flashlight beam cut through the gloom and found the figure of Rick Abath, still handcuffed to a steam pipe. Then, 40 yards away, Randy Heston. The duct tape was cut away from their faces. They were cold, stiff, and deeply shaken. But they were alive and, physically, largely unharmed. Their ordeal, which had lasted nearly 8 hours, was finally over. The first crucial eyewitnesses to the greatest art heist in history were now in the care of paramedics and detectives, their minds still reeling from the long, terrifying night. As the scope of the theft became clear, the Boston police knew they were dealing with something far beyond a typical robbery. The call went out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The theft of major artworks is a federal crime, especially when, as was suspected, the pieces might be transported across state lines. The FBI's Boston field office took the lead, and Special Agent Daniel Falzon was assigned as the lead investigator. Falzon was a calm, methodical man, experienced in complex cases. He and his team descended on the museum, turning Isabella's Palace of Art into an official federal crime scene. Yellow police tape was strung across the grand entrances. The museum, which should have been preparing to welcome its Sunday visitors, was now swarming with men and women in dark suits and windbreakers, speaking in low, serious tones. Forensic teams in white coveralls began the painstaking process of dusting for fingerprints and searching for trace evidences, stray hair, a fiber from a piece of clothing, a footprint missed by the thieves. They moved with a reverence that befitted the space, their modern, scientific procedures, a strange counterpoint to the centuries of history that surrounded them. Anne Hawley, the museum's director, arrived amidst this controlled chaos. She was a poised and formidable woman, deeply dedicated to the museum and to Isabella Gardner's legacy. The sight that greeted her was her worst nightmare made real. She walked with the investigators through her museum, a place she knew intimately, and saw the desecration firsthand. The empty frames were a physical blow. She understood, more than anyone, what their absence meant. It wasn't just the monetary value, which was astronomical and, in a sense, meaningless. It was the violation of Isabella's will. It was the destruction of the perfect, immersive world she had so carefully created. The empty spaces on the walls were not just missing paintings. They were holes torn in the fabric of a masterpiece. The inventory of the stolen works was a slow, heartbreaking process. In the Dutch room, Vermeer's The Concert, Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, Rembrandt's self-portrait etching, Gavard, Flink's landscape with an obelisk, and a Shang Dynasty bronze goo. From the short gallery, 5 Degas drawings of horses and jockeys, and from the first floor Spanish cloister, the bafflingly singular theft of Manet's Chez Tortoni. 13 pieces in total. The initial estimated value floated around $200 million. It would soon climb to 300 million and then to 500 million. In truth, the works were priceless. They were part of a public trust, so unique and so famous that they could never be sold on the open market. Their value lay in their existence, in their accessibility to the world. And now they were gone. The forensic examination of the scene revealed a puzzling mix of professionalism and sloppiness. On one hand, the thieves had been incredibly effective. They had neutralized the guards without serious injury, bypassed the security system, and spent an astonishing 81 minutes inside the museum, completely undetected. They had shown the forensic awareness to take the motion detector data tapes with them, preventing investigators from tracking their precise movements through the museum. This suggested a high level of planning and criminal sophistication. On the other hand, there were signs of amateurism. The crude way they had cut the canvases from the frames was the act of someone who either didn't know or didn't care about the proper handling of art. An expert would have carefully removed the canvas from its stretcher, a more time-consuming but far less damaging process. Why go to the trouble of stealing a Rembrandt only to immediately and drastically damage it? Furthermore, their choices were erratic. They stole the bronze Jew, an object of immense historical and artistic value, but one that only a specialist would recognize. Yet, they left behind the museum's Titian, The Rape of Europa, a painting considered by many to be the single most valuable work in the collection. It hung, untouched, in a nearby gallery. They tried and failed to steal the Napoleonic Eagle Finial, a relatively low-value item, suggesting they were improvising or working from a flawed shopping list. They took the Degas sketches, but left more valuable drawings in the same room. The only physical evidence left behind was minimal: a roll of duct tape, the handcuffs used on the guards. But fingerprints were scarce. The thieves had almost certainly worn gloves. The crime scene was remarkably clean. The investigation, therefore, would have to rely heavily on the testimony of the two guards. Rick Abath and Randy Heston were separated and interviewed at length by the FBI. Their stories were the foundation of the entire investigation. They described the two men. Both were white, in their 30s or early 40s. One was of medium height and build, the other taller and heavier. The most memorable detail was the fake, bushy mustache worn by one of the men, and the fact that their police uniforms seemed just slightly off. They spoke with what sounded like Boston accents. They had been calm, cool, and methodical. They had not seemed nervous or rushed, even while committing a crime of this magnitude. The focus of the investigation, as is standard procedure, immediately fell on the possibility of an inside job, and Rick Abath, through no fault of his own, beyond a youthful carelessness, was at the center of that theory. His actions on the night of the heist were: two investigators, a series of bright red flags. Why had he silenced the fire alarms without investigating? Why had he opened the side door earlier in the night, in clear violation of the rules? And most critically, why had he buzzed in the two men, breaking the museum's most fundamental security protocol? Abath became the subject of intense scrutiny. His friends were interviewed. His phone records were checked. His life was put under a microscope. He was given a polygraph test, the results of which were inconclusive, not uncommon outcome for someone who has just undergone a traumatic event. Abath maintained his innocence throughout. He was, he claimed, simply a young man who had been fooled by professionals. He was a rock musician, not a security expert. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but he was not a conspirator. To the FBI, however, he remained a person of interest. The possibility that he had been either a willing participant or had been coerced into helping the thieves was a theory they could not yet dismiss. While the internal investigation focused on the guards, another line of inquiry looked outward into the murky world of Boston's criminal underworld. In 1990, Boston was a city with a deeply entrenched, organized crime presence. Most famously, the Irish-American Winter Hill Gang, led by the notorious James Whitey Bulger. Could this have been their work? A crime of this scale and audacity seemed beyond the scope of typical mob activity, which usually involved racketeering, loan sharking, and drug trafficking. But the professionalism of the thieves, their confidence and control, did suggest a connection to some form of organized crime. Perhaps the paintings weren't meant to be sold, but to be used as leverage, a get-out-of-jail-free card for an incarcerated mob boss or collateral for a major deal. The FBI began to discreetly ask their informants in the criminal underworld, shaking the trees to see what might fall out. A third theory, and one that captured the public imagination, was that of the eccentric Longwolf collector. The idea of a Dr. No-like villain hidden away in a remote castle or a high-tech penthouse who had commissioned the theft to fill specific gaps in his private collection. This theory was fueled by the specific and seemingly curated list of stolen items. Perhaps the collector already had a Titian, but desperately wanted a Vermeer. Perhaps he had a passion for Degas horses or for Napoleonic memorabilia. It was a romantic, cinematic notion, but art crime experts were skeptical. Such collectors are largely a myth, a creation of fiction. A true art lover would never commission a theft that involved brutally cutting a masterpiece from its frame, and the risk of discovery would be immense. The art world is a small, interconnected community. A stolen Vermeer is not something you can hang in your living room and show off to your friends. The stolen Gardner paintings were so famous, they were essentially radioactive. They were impossible to sell and impossible to display. As these theories swirled among investigators, the news of the heist exploded onto the world stage. On Monday morning, and Hawley stood before a massive crowd of reporters and television cameras. The steps of the Gardner Museum, normally a quiet entrance to a place of contemplation, were now a chaotic media scrum. With great composure, she read a statement, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. She described the stolen works, emphasizing their cultural rather than monetary value. She spoke of the museum as a public trust and of the theft as a crime against all of humanity. And she made a direct plea to the thieves, or to anyone who might have information. The museum's sole purpose now, she said, is the safe return of the works of art. We will do whatever it takes. The public reaction was one of shock and collective grief. In Boston, the Gardner was a beloved, almost magical place. It was where school children had their first encounter with great art, where couples went on first dates, where people went to find a moment of peace in the middle of the city. The theft felt personal. People left flowers at the museum's locked gates. Letters of support poured in from around the world. The story was front-page news from New York to London to to Tokyo. The fame of the stolen works, which had once been their protection, now made their disappearance a global event. In the days that followed, the museum remained closed, a silent, wounded giant. Inside, investigators continued their meticulous work. They re-interviewed the guards. They built psychological profiles of the thieves. They followed up on the hundreds and then thousands of tips that began to pour in. The calls came from psychics, from disgruntled art students, from prison inmates looking to trade information for a reduced sentence. Every lead, no matter how outlandish, had to be checked. The FBI released sketches of the two suspects based on the guards' descriptions. The faces, one clean-shaven, the other with a comically fake mustache, were soon plastered on newspapers and television screens across the country. A reward was offered, $1 million for information leading to the recovery of the art. It was an unprecedented sum at the time. The hope was that greed would triumph over loyalty, that someone, somewhere, in a criminal chain would be tempted by the money. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and there was nothing. The thieves had vanished, as if into thin air. The paintings, with a combined surface area of over 200 square feet, had disappeared without a trace. There were no credible ransom demands, no sightings of the art. The initial flood of tips slowed to a trickle and then dried up. The investigation, which had started with such intensity and global attention, began the long, frustrating process of becoming a cold case. Inside the museum, a difficult decision had to be made. According to Isabella's will, nothing could be permanently changed. To hang reproductions in the empty frames would be a violation. To leave the galleries closed indefinitely was unthinkable. So, in a gesture of profound hope and deep mourning, Anne Hawley and the trustees decided to reopen the museum, leaving the empty frames hanging on the walls. They hang there still to this day. They are a constant, silent reminder of what was lost. They are a placeholder, a statement of faith that one day the Vermeer and the Rembrandts will come home. They have become, in their own right, a powerful and haunting work of art, a testament to absence, and the starting point of a mystery that continues to endure, a quiet, unsolved puzzle, waiting for its final pieces to be put into place. We return to our story, but the landscape has changed. The initial chaotic days of the investigation have given way to a new reality. One that is quieter, slower, and far more frustrating. The mystery of the Gardner heist has entered a new phase. The long, cold years of a seemingly unsolvable puzzle. Our focus now shifts from the crime itself to the patient, painstaking, and often fruitless search for the ghosts who committed it and for the priceless treasures they carried with them. Into the night, the years began to spool out, one after another, like thread from a spindle. The 1990s unfolded. The world changed. But inside the Gardner Museum, time remained stubbornly fixed. Visitors would walk into the Dutch room and fall silent, their gaze drawn not to the art that was there, but to the art that was not. The empty frames became the most potent exhibit in the building. They spoke of loss, of fragility, and of a violation that time could not heal. They were a question mark hanging on the wall, a constant public plea for an answer. For the FBI and the museum, the investigation never truly stopped. It simply went underground, becoming a slow, grinding process of following thin leads and chasing distant echoes. The case file grew thicker, filled with dead-end interviews, reports from psychics, and confessions from publicity-seeking cranks. The reward money, first $1 million, then increased to $5 million by the museum, was a powerful lure. But it produced more noise than signal. The original investigators grew older, retired, or were reassigned. A new generation of agents inherited the heavy binders and the weighty burden of the unsolved case. The art world, too, was on constant alert. Every major auction, every private sale, every police raid on a suspected art trafficker was scrutinized for any sign of the Gardner's lost children. Interpol sent alerts to police forces around the globe. The descriptions of the Vermeer, the Rembrandts, and the others were logged in international databases of stolen art. They were. And yet, they remained completely, stubbornly invisible. One of the most compelling figures to emerge during this period was a man named Harold Smith. He was not an FBI agent or a police detective, but an independent art recovery specialist, a sort of freelance bounty hunter for stolen masterpieces. Smith was a flamboyant and tenacious character, known for his unconventional methods and his deep connections in the often shady world of art and antiques. The Gardner Museum hired him in the mid-1990s to pursue avenues the FBI either couldn't or wouldn't. Smith believed that the solution to the mystery lay not in conventional police work, but in understanding the criminal mind and infiltrating its networks. He pursued the theory that the art had been stolen for a specific client, possibly the Irish Republican Army, or for a reclusive collector. He traveled the world on the museum's dime, chasing whispers and rumors, meeting with informants in smoky bars and shadowy backrooms. He was a man who seemed to have stepped out of a detective novel, and his involvement added a layer of intrigue and hope to the stagnant investigation. But for all his efforts, for all the miles he traveled and the hands he shook, Harold Smith, too, came up empty-handed. The trail was always cold, the source always one step removed. The art remained a phantom. Then, in 1994, 4 years after the theft, came the first truly tantalizing glimmer of hope. Anne Hawley, the museum's director, received an anonymous letter. The writer claimed to be an intermediary, a third party, who had been authorized to negotiate the return of the stolen art. The letter was articulate and intelligent. The author made it clear they were not one of the original thieves, but a facilitator who sought to broker a deal that would be profitable for the current holders of the art and would grant immunity from prosecution. This was the moment the museum had been waiting for. A secret, cautious correspondence began. The museum, working with the FBI, was instructed to take out a classified ad in the Boston Herald newspaper with a coded message to signal their willingness to negotiate. The ad was placed a nervous, hopeful, quiet descended over the small group of people who knew about the communication. It felt as if they were on the brink of a breakthrough. A second letter arrived. The writer proposed a complex plan. The art would be returned in exchange for $2.6 million and full immunity for everyone involved. The writer demonstrated knowledge that suggested they were, at the very least, close to the real art. They correctly identified one of the stolen Degas drawings as being a less valuable watercolor, a detail not widely publicized. They seemed legitimate. The sense of anticipation was almost unbearable. But then, just as quickly as it began, the communication ceased. The anonymous negotiator went silent. The museum waited. They placed more coded messages in the paper. There was no reply. The trail, which for a moment had seemed so warm, went ice-cold once more. Why did the writer disappear? Had they lost their nerve? Was their access to the art cut off? Or had the entire exchange been an elaborate, cruel hoax? The answer never came. It was another dead end, another ghost that vanished at dawn, leaving behind only a profound sense of disappointment and the lingering question of what might have been. The empty frames in the Dutch room seemed to mock their efforts as the new millennium dawned. The focus of the FBI's investigation began to coalesce around a new and more concrete theory. The leads were no longer pointing towards international terrorists or eccentric billionaires. They were pointing much closer to home, into the grimy, violent, and insular world of Boston's traditional, organized crime families. Specifically, a faction based in the suburban neighborhood of Dorchester, run by a mob captain named Carmelo Merlino. Merlino was a career criminal, a tough, old-school gangster involved in robbery and racketeering. In 1999, he and several members of his crew were arrested by the FBI for plotting to rob an armored car depot It was during the aftermath of this arrest that the Gardner case resurfaced in a startling way. Facing a long prison sentence, Merlino began to talk, not to the FBI directly, but to his associates and to informants who were listening. He boasted that he knew where the Gardner paintings were. He claimed he could facilitate their return in exchange for the museum's $5 million reward and a reduction in his sentence. This was a major development. For the first time, a credible figure from the criminal underworld was linking himself to the stolen art. The FBI pressed hard. They interviewed Merlino's associates. One informant told them that Merlino had once taken him to see what he claimed was one of the stolen Rembrandts, showing him the raw, cut edges of the canvas. Another story emerged that Merlino had tried to sell the art shortly after the theft, but had found no buyers. The works were simply too hot to handle, the theory that began to form was this: the heist was not a sophisticated, commissioned theft. It was an old-fashioned smash-on grab, carried out by a crew of competent, but ultimately unsophisticated, local thieves. They had stolen the art not for its beauty, but for its perceived value, thinking they could ransom it back or sell it on the black market. But they had overestimated their abilities and underestimated the fame of the works. They found themselves in possession of $500 million worth of property that they couldn't move. The paintings became a liability, a dangerous secret that was passed around, hidden, and perhaps even forgotten in the basements and attics of Boston's criminal underbelly. The trail from Merlino led investigators to another key figure, a mobster named Robert the Cook Garente. Garente was a formidable and feared figure in the New England Mafia. After Garente's death in 2004, his widow, Eileen, began to speak to the FBI. She told them a remarkable story. She said that sometime after the heist, her husband had come into possession of some of the paintings. She claimed that another mob associate, a man named Robert Bobby Donati, had been involved in the theft and had given 2 or 3 of the paintings to her husband for safekeeping. Donati himself could not confirm or deny this. He had been brutally murdered in 1991 in an unrelated gangland slaying. Just a year after the Gardner theft, Eileen Garente's testimony was a bombshell. She claimed that before her husband died, he passed the paintings on to yet another associate, a close friend of his from Connecticut, an aging, low-level mobster named Robert Gentile. With that, the full weight of the FBI's 2-decade-long investigation began to shift and settle onto one man. Robert Gentile, or Bobby as he was known, became the investigation's best and perhaps last hope. Gentile was in his 70s, living a quiet life in a suburban home in Manchester, Connecticut. He had a criminal record, but was seen as a minor player. He certainly didn't live a lavish lifestyle, but he was a known associate of the Merlino crew, and he had been a close friend of Robert Guarente. When the FBI approached him, he vehemently denied everything. He knew nothing about the paintings, he said. He had never seen them. He was just an old man with a bad back. The FBI didn't believe him. They were convinced he was either lying or holding back crucial information. In 2012, they orchestrated a sting operation and arrested Gentile on unrelated drug and weapons charges, hoping the pressure of a federal indictment would make him talk. They searched his house from top to bottom. The search was a media event, with news helicopters circling overhead. They found guns, cash, and police scanners, but they did not find any priceless paintings. However, they did find one very intriguing piece of evidence. In a shed behind the house, hidden beneath a false floor, they found a handwritten list. It was a list of the 13 stolen Gardner artworks, and next to each item was a potential black market price. The Vermeer, for example, was valued in the millions. The Degas sketches were listed for much less. Why would an old man who claimed to know nothing about the theft have a detailed list of the stolen goods and their estimated illicit value hidden in his shed? Gentile claimed the list was not his. He said a friend had given it to him years ago, and he had simply forgotten about it. The FBI put Gentile in prison and continued to pressure him. They offered him deals. They offered him release. They offered him money. They told him, "All we want is the paintings. Just tell us where they are." They even had the U.S. Attorney for Connecticut sit down with him personally and promise him that if he led them to the art, he could walk out of jail a free man. But Gentile never broke. He insisted, time and again, that he didn't know anything. He failed a polygraph test when asked about the paintings. His story changed slightly over time. He admitted that Robert Guarente's widow had once mentioned the paintings to him, and that Guarente himself might have had them at some point. He even suggested that Guarente's widow might have the art herself, but he never admitted to having possession of them himself. Was he a man of incredible loyalty, honoring a criminal code of silence, even at the cost of his own freedom? Or was he simply, as he claimed, an old man who knew nothing, caught in the middle of a mystery far bigger than himself? The FBI believed the former. They were convinced Gentile was the key. Then, in March of 2013, 23 years to the month after the theft, the FBI held a major press conference in Boston. Richard Deslauriers, the special agent in charge of the Boston office, stood before the cameras and made a stunning announcement. For the first time, the FBI stated publicly that they knew who had stolen the art. They did not name the thieves, but they confirmed they were deceased members of a criminal organization with roots in New England and the Mid-Atlantic states. This pointed directly at the circle of men around Carmelo Merlino and Robert Guarente. Des lawyers went further. He said the FBI had traced the journey of the art in the years after the theft. He stated with a high degree of confidence that the paintings were transported to Connecticut and the Philadelphia area. He said they were offered for sale in Philadelphia around 2003, and then the trail went cold again. The purpose of the press conference was clear. It was a public appeal. The FBI was no longer just searching for the original thieves. They were searching for anyone who might have seen the art more recently. Perhaps the paintings had been sold. Perhaps they had been given away. Perhaps they were hanging in a private home or stored in an attic. Their current owners, unaware of their true origin or too frightened to come forward. The message was, the original culprits are dead. You will not be prosecuted. We just want the art back. To amplify this plea, the Gardner Museum increased the reward again, this time to a staggering $10 million for information leading directly to the recovery of all 13 works in good condition. A separate $100,000 reward was offered for the return of the Napoleonic eagle, finial, alone. The offer came with a statute of limitations for the theft itself, having long since passed, and a promise of confidentiality. It was the largest private reward ever offered for stolen property. $10 million. A life-changing amount of money waiting for one person to make one phone call, and yet still nothing. The years continued to pass. Robert Gentile, the FBI's best lead, was eventually released from prison due to his failing health. He died in 2021 at the age of 85, maintaining his innocence to the very end. If he held the secret to the location of the art, he took it with him to his grave. Carmelo Merlino had died in prison years earlier. One by one, the men who may have known what happened that rainy St. Patrick's night and in the days and years that followed were gone. The threads of the investigation, which had once led to living, breathing people, now led only to tombstones. So where does that leave us? Where does it leave our story? It leaves us here, in the quiet of the night, by the warmth of the fire, with one of the greatest mysteries of the art world still unsolved. The 13 stolen objects remained lost to the world. Are they destroyed? It's possible, in a fit of panic, or during a house fire, or through simple neglect. The delicate canvases and ancient artifacts could have been lost forever. It's a heartbreaking thought. Are they hidden away in some secret vault, part of a mythical, private collection? It seems unlikely, given the criminal origins of the thieves. It's more probable that if they still exist, they are hidden in a much more mundane place, a dusty attic, a storage locker, the space behind a basement wall. Perhaps they were buried in a backyard and have long since rotted away. Or perhaps, just perhaps, they are still together, wrapped in old blankets, waiting in the dark for someone to find the courage to bring them back into the light. The story of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist is a story with no ending. And that, in a way, is why it is a perfect story for tonight. Its purpose is not to be resolved, but to be contemplated. It's a story about time, about loss, and about the enduring power of art, even in its absence. The empty frames on the museum's walls have become as famous as the masterpieces they once held. They are a monument to a moment of brazen audacity and to the decades of silent, echoing questions that have followed. Let the details of the story, the names, the dates, the winding paths of the investigation begin to soften in your mind. Let them become part of the gentle, crackling sound of the fire. They have served their purpose, giving your mind a path to follow, a quiet and intricate narrative to hold its attention, keeping it from the restless anxieties of the day. Now it is time to let the story go. Picture the grand, silent museum in the heart of Boston. The courtyard is dark, the flowers asleep. The galleries are empty, save for the ghosts of what was lost. The mystery remains, but it is not yours to solve tonight. Your only task now is to rest, feel the warmth of the fire on your skin. Listen to its soft, steady rhythm. It is the sound of time passing, the sound of the world settling into stillness. With each breath you take, feel your body growing heavier, more relaxed. With each breath out, let go of the last remnants of the story, of the day, of any thought that holds you from sleep. There is nothing left to do, nothing to figure out. There is only the darkness, the warmth, and the quiet. Let the gentle crackle of the embers be the last sound you hear as you drift away into a deep and peaceful rest.